I'm Ken Paulson. I'm the director of the Free Speech Center at Middle Tennessee State University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this conversation with Dr. Brian Hinote. He is the Associate Vice Provost at Middle Tennessee State University, focusing on student success, and he has just completed a report that, on behalf of the Free Speech Center, that takes a look at how we can best teach the next generation about the First Amendment. Welcome, Dr. Hinote.
Thank you so much, Ken. Thanks to you and the Free Speech Center for taking some time to talk with me today.
So let's go to the heart of the work you've been doing for a good number of years, ensuring an environment in which students can in fact succeed. What do you see as the connection between understanding the core principles of the First Amendment, freedom of speech and press and faith, and of course the rights to petition and assemble? How do those play into making a more successful student?
As I note in the white paper, right, we talk about how these 5 freedoms of the First Amendment are really the fundamental parts of being an American and of participating in the American democracy. For college students in particular, they represent the near future of our society, and the extent to which they understand the 5 freedoms and so many other principles of the Constitution and other sort of key bedrock cornerstone documents of the United States is such an important part of what our democracy and what our republic is going to look like in, as I said, the near future.
So do you have a sense that students today, the ones you interact with on campus daily, is the First Amendment, is the Constitution even in the forefront for them? Is it something they ever give thought to?
I don't think necessarily so. And as we may or may not have time to talk about today, that might be a little bit on us as educators. But it doesn't seem to me that they're thinking about these constitutional principles in general and the First Amendment 5 freedoms in particular at a level that we would expect. So in short, I would say, no, I don't think they're engaging that in a fundamental way.
Can you talk a bit about your methodology? You went out across the country and talked with representatives of universities across the nation, a cross section of kinds of schools and approaches. How did you amass your information?
We spent time with colleagues and students at 10 universities across the United States. And the methodology I employed is a mixture of group or focus group methodology as well as in detailed interviews. So I collected those data again across those 10 institutions, and in partnering with the Free Speech Center at Middle Tennessee State University, these particular institutions were chosen because of their previous engagement in the Free Speech Center's One for All campaign. So I compiled the data from those focus groups and interviews and tried to really summarize and synthesize a number of different themes and collect them into best practices so that colleagues across the nation can hopefully adopt some of these, synthesize some of these insights into their own ideas, and really make a mark in promoting First Amendment advocacy, activism, and engagement among American university students.
So to be clear to those who may not be familiar with our work or the One for All campaign, I want to make clear this is not a survey, this is not a poll. This was essentially, in some ways, a brainstorming of concepts that have been used and applied by universities to engage students on the First Amendment and these core principles. For our part, the One for All campaign, with the help of some generous donors and supporters, have been able to provide modest funding to universities at their request just to try to do something, in some cases, anything that will provoke thought about the First Amendment on America's college campuses. How do you engage students? How do you ensure that more than a handful understand the 5 principles of the First Amendment and how they work in democracy? So we've begun by looking, I think in the past year, we probably had events on 20 to 25 campuses. But the idea is if you can figure out what works, what really gets students thinking about the importance of free speech. And the underlying conceit here is that if people understand that their freedom of speech is directly related to their others' freedom of speech and hopefully a willingness to listen to each other, we are a far better society. So where we are now is sort of a jumping off point. We provide modest amounts of money to professors and others who experiment with this. And Dr. Hinote has gone out and said, so what did you do and what worked? So in terms of your own research, what were takeaways that surprised you? What did you find that you did not anticipate in jumping into this project?
We found in general, or I found in general, that low levels of engagement and a low level of depth and detail when thinking about the First Amendment among most college students. I was first and foremost probably surprised by the levels of engagement by subsets of students that are studying in PR, journalism, and communications fields. These data really were rich data that really just bubbled up from my conversations with students when no one else was around, and so much enthusiasm, so much insight, and so much of application of First Amendment principles. Again, I'm trained as a sociologist, Ken, as you know, and the depth and level of understanding that so many of these students demonstrated surpassed that even of my own sort of comprehension and application of these First Amendment principles. So if I had to pick one thing, it would be, as always, again, my background in student success is engaging with those students in a way that allowed them to show me the path forward in terms of what works and thinking about First Amendment principles. Very powerful.
The challenge we have here, of course, is that some of this is self-selective. We've sent you out to campuses where they already demonstrated a commitment to educating students on the First Amendment. It could well be that they emphasize it, and then when we ask about it, sure enough, it happened. Our investment was a good one. I wonder, though, does it have something to do with the particular curriculum? Not the curriculum being taught, but the subject matter being taught. We all use the First Amendment in our work and professional and personal lives. But for some reason, journalists and future public relations professionals, they get it better, or it's just a question of they are taught it in greater detail?
I think it's a little bit of both, Ken. But as you'll note in the white paper that we're discussing now, the curricular part or the in-class element of that First Amendment engagement, I think, really only begins to scratch the surface of so much more. So while we talk about in-class engagement and activities and other tools that educators can use to touch upon the First Amendment with university students, I would argue that so much more takes place or can take place out of class. And so I think it's both, Ken. I think that students in these respective disciplines are exposed to effective practices first and foremost. I also think that because of their identification with those particular disciplines, they are also motivated to dive in deeper to those principles.
Dr. Hinote, I want to ask you a question I've never asked you, which means this conversation could come to like a screeching halt. But let's assume you got the call tomorrow to be the president of a major university, and you've just done this research. As the president of a university, what might you do to instill a spirit of understanding of the marketplace of ideas and the importance of the First Amendment on a campus, especially if, as you're suggesting, this can be done outside the classroom?
One overarching principle that I point to in the white paper is quite simple, and this is actually the words of a student in our data. If information doesn't apply to you, then it's not going to matter. So, as president, I would number one, and one of the most important things that presidents do to things that they think are important are funding. Okay, provide funding for campus-wide activities to specifically target students and meet them where they are. Make it apply to them. Otherwise, quite simply, it's not going to matter.
If we were to condense your findings, and I should emphasize right now that the full report, which is highly readable, accessible, and insightful, is available at freespeech.center, which is our website, freespeech.center, under the tab Education. So you can read this for yourself. But how would you give us a condensed sense? Will you please give us a condensed sense of what the white paper is distilled down into?
I did my very best in this report to do what you just said, condense these data, which are rich, are detailed, and often get into very complex themes. Condense them down to about just under a dozen sets of practices that educators and other practitioners or other colleagues can adopt in engaging students in First Amendment thinking. You know, these particular sets of practices range from everything from actually building the First Amendment into the physical environment, which was a surprising finding and a very interesting one to me, all the way to thinking of ways to bridge cultural boundaries as a way to bring our First Amendment principles into better focus. So many of these practices are built around, as I just mentioned, hands-on engagement, okay, targeted campus events, as well as those in-class activities as well that help students build bridges to understand their own life and their connection to those First Amendment practices as well. So all of these are distilled down to these sets of and these categories of activities in a way to, again, help foster that First Amendment understanding, advocacy, and activism.
In other words, this doesn't happen by accident. It's got to be a proactive effort by educators to make sure these principles are understood. And so when they step off the college campus, they are not only accomplished students and graduates, but they're also better citizens.
And that intentionality is such an important part of beginning to think about how we might approach, or how our viewers today, how they might approach promoting these ideas on their campuses as well.
I want to leave you with just one observation, and I'd be interested in your reaction to it. You know, for all the creative and ambitious efforts to try to engage students on the First Amendment, it turns out, based on your research, that just putting a sign up with the words of the First Amendment does wonders, that somehow it's transformative in terms of the culture of a school of journalism, for example. And it just seems so simple and so basic, but it's sort of like you want students to learn something, put it on the blackboard. I was intrigued by the observation that so many successful efforts were actually built around kind of a shrine.
I had that aha moment, just spending time with colleagues at one particular university, where quite simply the First Amendment was I guess you could say, larger than life. This was like a 6 by 8 to 10 foot installation with big wooden block or some similar material letters, including those principles and the word by word the First Amendment, so that when you walked into the School of Communications, and as you looked out the glass walls of the student news station, you view these all the time. So such a powerful statement for anyone that walks through those doors, that here on these grounds, these are the principles that will guide our work. These are the principles that will guide our interaction. And students at that same university said, hey, look around. You can scarcely go anywhere in our disciplines and not see some physical representation of the First Amendment. And virtually all of those include those words, word for word. Quite a powerful element of the physical environment, I think.
Your report collects a lot of research that's been done, and over again we see that Americans have not even the most rudimentary understanding of the First Amendment and freedom of speech in America. Most recently, we've had exchange with some people on our various social media outlets who are complaining that Facebook violates their First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, because it polices what they're posting, and inevitably then they'll say, isn't this a violation? And we'll say, no, it's a private company. They have a right to decide what to post. And then they will confidently say, no, you're wrong. and our ulterior motive here is to avoid those no, you're wrong conversations, to have people understand how the system works and why it's so important to protect these core freedoms. Dr. Hinote, thank you for your efforts. We are greatly appreciative of your report and sharing your thoughts here today. We hope that what you've done will lay a foundation for a lot of universities to take the next step and make a real commitment to making sure these 5 freedoms are known, respected, and embraced by the next generation of students. Absolutely, Ken. The pleasure is all mine. It's, I think, a great piece of research. Thanks to you, and thanks to the Free Speech Center for putting this out there. I think there are some important insights embedded in this document, and it's my hope that, again, our colleagues, our educators, and other practitioners across the country can apply these in a productive way. Thank you, Dr. Hinote. It's been a pleasure.